Globis.
Thank you very much. So we have a very good balance of powers, I would say, on this panel today. The three major countries in Europe, we have a great panelist. Nick is obviously representing the UK, a lot going on in that country where somewhat surprising results of the recent election. And obviously, there is quite a bit of a discussion going on between Japan and the UK, where the Prime Minister recently visiting Japan had a lot of interesting discussion as to the trade talks and other topics. So he can give us an update in terms of what's happening in the UK front. Caroline is an expert when it comes to French politics. She is from France. France has been also experiencing very interesting last couple months since the elections. As you know, the new government in France, it's a very different type of government versus what we have seen in the past. So that's slightly different from the UK situation, and also Germany. Patrick, who is an expert in when it comes to German politics. Germany, as you probably know, is going to have their general elections this weekend, in about a week time. So we'll see what happens. From what I can see, what I can read, there should not be major surprises. That's what I've been told. So we are likely to have the same leadership. But in terms of coalition government partner, we don't know what is going to happen on that front. So Patrick can give us an update on that front as well. So I figured we should start this panel discussion by asking the panelists to give us the update in terms of the domestic politics. As I said, there are three countries that we're going to focus on in this discussion. So let's talk about the politics in the UK first. And then obviously we'll move on to the more general discussion in terms of EU. But let's see what's happening in the UK. Nick, if you can give us an update of what you're seeing right now.
Sure. Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to join your panel. We've been having a fairly interesting time politically in the UK over the last couple of years. First of all, of course, last year we had the referendum on Britain's membership of the EU and the unexpected result that by a narrow but decisive majority the public voted to leave. The prevalent view in the UK amongst politicians of all parties and amongst the public is that the result of the referendum must be respected. There are those that continue to argue that with such a narrow result, the result should be contested. And that includes arguing for a second referendum, for instance, over the terms of Britain's withdrawal. But the majority of members of Parliament voted to trigger the legal process by which Britain will leave the EU. So in March this year, that was triggered. It set the countdown to a 2-year timetable, and Britain will leave the European Union by March 2019. So we currently have had the start of the first round of negotiations on that process. And Britain's ambition is to firstly leave on good terms, remembering that Britain remains a member of Europe, if not the European Union, a part of Europe. Secondly, to negotiate a trade deal with the European Union, which, insofar as possible, preserves frictionless trade with a trading bloc which still accounts for half of our trade overall. And I can talk a bit more about that later if you would like to. There's no doubt, though, that this has been an event that has dominated British politics. And it resulted in the change of Prime Minister. So Theresa May took over from David Cameron, who of course resigned in the immediate aftermath of the referendum. And she unexpectedly called a general election earlier this year. And again, the pundits were proved wrong when the expectation that she would win the election by a very large majority was considerably upset. And although the Conservative Party remains the largest party in the House of Commons, I'm a Conservative member of Parliament, and we have formed the government. It is a minority government, and that will have a number of effects. It makes it hard for the British government to get its business through, although we have done a deal with the minority party to ensure that essential items of legislation and our budget and so on can be secured in the House of Commons. But it also probably means that there will be a softer Brexit than might otherwise have happened, reflecting the views of the House of Commons. Because while a majority of members of Parliament have decided that it is right that we leave the European Union, that same majority also voted to remain. I, in fact, was one of the leaders of the Remain campaign last year. And there is an anxiety to ensure that we do not unnecessarily find ourselves in a hard Brexit situation, by which I mean that Britain crashes out of the EU in or before March 2019 on World Trade Organization rules in the absence of an agreement with the EU. And although the WTO average tariff is fairly low, that's certainly not true in relation to certain sectors, including the automotive sector, and in relation to much of our agricultural produce. And it is widely agreed that it would be undesirable for that to happen. So the current debate in the UK is about the potential transitional arrangements that might be put in place to ensure that there isn't a cliff edge in March 2019, and to give as much certainty as is possible to businesses that there will continue to be the frictionless trade within the EU that they have enjoyed. And perhaps that's the last thing I will just say, that while much debate in the UK ahead of the referendum focused on the economic impact of Brexit, it is true that the fundamentals of Britain's economy that have resulted in a relatively successful economic performance and the recovery of our economy since the global financial meltdown a decade ago will remain in place. And that is a relatively benign fiscal regime, relatively benign labour market regulation that makes Britain an attractive place for investors, including, of course, the absolutely vital inward investment that we receive from Japan, some £40 billion worth a year of inward investment that the UK received. And we are confident that provided that we can negotiate the new trade deal with the EU that I spoke of, that with those advantages remaining, Britain will remain an attractive place to do business and still an attractive place for inward investment.
Thank you, Nick. So we're going to move on to France, which is a very different from the UK in terms of where the country is in terms of political situation, with a new, very young leader. And also the cabinet members, if you look at them, they're very young. They're about 10 years at least on average in terms of the age of the new cabinet members versus the previous government. It's interesting. So, Caroline, can you give us an update in terms of what you are seeing on the latest in the political scene in France?
Sure, and maybe I'll come back just for a second on what Nick just said about the UK's relation to Europe. I think it was Juncker who said just after the Brexit, quoting a famous song, "You can check in, but you don't check out," of Europe. And that's pretty much what Macron said about globalization. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, in the same spirit. You don't check out of Europe that easily. You don't check out of globalization that easily. And there was, that was in the context of anti-EU being equated with anti-globalization. In the mind of European voters, that's pretty much the same thing. Brussels is bad, globalization is bad, or on the contrary, it's good. And Macron was saying it's not neither good or bad, it's there. And if you think you can get out of Europe or Europeanization or globalization, you're kidding yourself, because we're in it. And he was, of course, also commenting on Trump's idea that you can get your borders back and you can shut down everything and you will be out of the world. So what happened in France, it was a very interesting time. There were 3 stages. The first one was that it looked like it was going to be politics as usual. The socialist, right, left, right, and then, and that was it. And then both of them, the traditional parties, collapsed for one reason or another. And then there was a scare. And then people thought, oh, it's going to be the extreme. So we're having the far right and the far left. And this is going to be the choice. And there was going to be a huge electorate that was not going to vote at all. There was a huge no-vote movement. And then suddenly something happened, and there was a red line that people did not want to cross, which was to elect especially the far right. And that brought along Emmanuel Macron. The other thing that was interesting, Emmanuel Macron is not of a party. I mean, he created his own movement, En Marche, meaning moving forward. And the other thing that was interesting was that Macron himself is completely an establishment guy. I would say, even we call him the kid, actually. He's that young. But he has no party. It's not party politics as usual. It's not trade union as usual. It's not those institutions that people are fed up with. And he completely understood what was going on in the US and in other parts of the world where people have this huge distrust of, politics, professional politicians. And the next and final stage was that in the parliamentary elections, indeed, we had a huge number of people who were completely new in politics. And the parliament we have now in France is relatively well gender balanced. We never had that many women in the parliament, and it's very young indeed. And indeed, we have also, young, new, non-politician in the government as well, but in the parliament in particular. So this is what really happened in France. And the other thing is, what is happening right now is the question of reform. So the mandate that was given to Macron, mind you, it wasn't a majority. We just had this discussion a little bit before. The people who are on the far right or on the far left are still there. I mean, the people who voted for Macron against Marine Le Pen, against the far right, voted against her, not for him. So disappointed, unhappy, anti-Europe, anti-globalization people are still around. But there's this idea that we give him a chance. We give Emmanuel Macron a chance, and he has to deliver. If he does not deliver, in 5 years from now, we're back in the chaos of having a non-reformed France and probably someone from the extreme. So the mood right now is that there's a lot of people against Macron and what he represents, people who are, protesting, but we had the first so-called major social movement this week, didn't go that far. So I think what will happen is that he will, and I'm pretty sure this is what he wants to do, he's just going to move forward with the reform, and we'll judge him in a year from now. And I think his idea, he was the only candidate that was openly pro-Europe, and obviously he's waiting for the elections in Germany, counting on, building something with probably Merkel, And the idea is that Europe is like a bicycle. If you stop now, if you decide that, okay, it's Brexit, it's terrible, the Poles, also we didn't speak about Poland and Eastern Europe, they're unhappy, everybody's unhappy, and, let's give up. Well, no, if you stop, it breaks. So not many options here. We have to move forward. And what Macron is betting on is that, well, let's build something strong with, core Europeans.
Thank you, Patrick. What do you expect? What are you expecting to see in a week from now? Where do you think you're going to be a week from now in Germany?
Okay. Thank you first that I can join this panel. Yeah, it looks like as if Germany is one of these boring elections, from Germany, the heart of stability in the middle of Europe, economic force. If you look to the polls right now, the elections are on Sunday. If you look to the polls right now, the Christian Democrats, the Conservatives are leading with about 36%. Social Democrats, the Social Democratic Party has about 24%. Which is a major difference compared to early in this year when there was some hope that the Social Democrats might take over the government. Then you have 4 smaller parties, the Green parties, the Ecological Party, you have the Free Democratic Party, the Liberal Party, you have the AfD, the so-called Alternative for Germany, which is the right-wing protest party against certain policies, and you have the leftists, these are the former social communists from the East German part of eastern part of Germany. So you have these 4 parties, and if you look to the polls, they are all somewhere between 8 to 10, sometimes 11%. So for the first time for decades, I think like the 60s, most probably you will have a parliament where you have 6 parties in there, and the first time since after World War II, you will have a more or less right-wing party in the German parliament. What are the options if you take these polls? What are the options for the government? Certainly, Chancellor Merkel is going to stay, and she's going to stay Chancellor. The question is, whom she is to govern with. Arithmetically, there are 2 options. One option is the so-called Jamaica coalition. This is the flag of Jamaica has the color of black, of green, and of yellow. Black is in Germany the color of the Christian Democrats, the Conservatives. Green is the color of the Green Party, and yellow is the color of the Free Democrats, the Liberal Party. So the idea is you might get an arithmetical majority for the government if you put these parties together. In my opinion, this is not going to happen because the differences between the Free Democrats, the Liberal Party, and the Green Party are much too big. Because the Green Party, you could call them Green Socialists, they want a lot of regulation, and the Free Democrats, they want much more free market-based policies. So as Chancellor Merkel is going for stability, I don't think that she's going for the so-called Jamaica coalition. So the other option that's left is just go on like before. You make a great coalition, a grand coalition between the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, and then you have the majority. There is a small opportunity if something changes in the next days that the liberals are getting much more votes in the parliament, and there is a small option that you get a conservative liberal government. We're going to talk about that later maybe. I don't think this is going to happen, but it might happen. Why is it so? Why is the German politics getting so boring? On the one hand, you have no major economic crisis in Germany. You have 8 years of growth. It doesn't look as if something's going to happen on the economic scenery. You have an unemployment rate of 5.7%. Last time it was as good was in 1981. So, from an economic point of view, Germany right now is just in a very comfortable position. So, what does these elections mean for Germany for economic policy? I would say it does not mean too much, because the same government is going to govern before, so you won't see too many changes in that respect. If the liberals get into the government, you might see a little bit more deregulation. Otherwise, you won't see a lot of deregulation, and everything is going on, and you will see more social policies, and will see more money spent for social democratic purposes. The interesting thing with these elections, I said this is a very boring election, but on the other hand, it's not boring at all, because you get this right-wing party into the parliament, which is quite an interesting event happening in Germany. The question is, why is this happening? If you look at the history of this right-wing party, I mean, it came up several years ago, and there were two major reasons. The first reason was the euro crisis, because a lot of Germans did not like the way how Europe solved the euro crisis. They did not like the way that Greece was bailed out. They did not like the way that Portugal, Cyprus, and other countries were bailed out, because this was explicitly promised to the Germans when they gave up the Deutschmark, that there won't be a bailout. But now it happened, and all these rules which were set up for the Eurozone were broken. And a lot of Germans don't like that idea. A lot of Germans don't like the idea to be paymaster for Europe, and they don't like the idea that they have to pay, as the biggest country in the Eurozone or in the EU, that they have to pay a lot of money. And that was the founding stone of this now right-wing party. And in the beginning, it was not a right-wing party, it was a protest party. It was a protest party against the Eurozone policies by the German government. Then happened this immigration shock when Germany opened the borders in 2015, 2016, and let more or less unregulated fugitives into Germany. And there are still several 10,000 of fugitives where the government don't know who they are, where they live, and how many they are. And this was another shift in the mood of the population, and that brought further support for this so-called alternative for Germany. What happened with this party now is, with the immigration shock, a lot of right-wingers got into this party, and all the more reasonable people, like economists and others who started the party in the beginning, they are pushed to aside. So now it's more or less a right-wing party. And that makes it pretty interesting, this election, because you don't know what's going to happen with these right-wingers if they have 10% or something like that in the parliament. What does it mean for Europe? You mentioned that Monsieur Macron is waiting for Chancellor Merkel to do some kind of common new project for the EU to save the EU, maybe. I'm not sure. I think that if you look to Germany, you have to realize most Germans are pro the EU. Most Germans, on the other hand, a lot of Germans, on the other hand, don't like the way how how the EU is managed. They don't like if rules which were set up, which means no bailout rules, are broken. They don't like other rules that are broken in the EU just to save the EU. The German understanding of a rules-based policy is you set up the rules and you stick to the rules, and you don't break the rules when you just want to muggle around a little bit. So Germans like the EU, but they don't like the way how the EU is handled. And this will be a major stepping stone, I suppose, when Monsieur Macron thinks that he wants to get Germany into the boat. Monsieur Macron gave just several speeches several weeks ago about installing a common European finance minister, installing a common European budget, installing a common European unemployment insurance. These are things, this is not going to happen with Germany, and this is not going to happen with the German government, with Chancellor Merkel. In that respect, Germany and France, in my understanding, are going to try to work together for the sake of the EU, but there is a major economic policy divide between both governments and both countries, and this policy divide is going to break up again, so it's not quite sure how far Monsieur Macron is going to come with his vision of a new European contract.
That's interesting, because that was going to be my next question. So what does that mean in terms of the new reality of EU post-UK? And you think it's not going to be all that easy in terms of how Germany and France are going to work together as the two major remaining powers within the EU. Caroline, you might have a slightly different view on that. What do you think is in terms of how France and Germany might work together in terms of pushing some common goals of the new under the new reality of EU umbrella? What do you think?
Well, it depends on which level you put yourself and where do you look from? If you look at the level of the citizen who's unhappy with Brussels, well, same thing in France. I mean, Brussels is incredibly unpopular in France. People hate to pay, well, they pay less for Greece than the Germans do, but they hate paying for Greece, for Spain, and all those, you know, southern people, untidy, etc. So, I mean, if you talk about popular sentiment, I would agree with you. But I think leaders, what leaders are about is to be leading and to have a vision of where the future should be. And there aren't that many options. You can decide that, you know, stay where we are, you know, the British are out, so it makes a weaker Europe and will go forward more or less. Trump is unreliable, and Putin we don't know, and the Chinese, what are they doing? Are they growing? And then North Korea is in the picture as well, not to mention Middle East. So we can sort of muddle through this chaos, or we can decide to have a vision and move forward. And I think the leader's vision is somewhere above that chaos. And I think definitely Macron wants to have, make a difference on the international scene. And he'll be very happy to be the leader if he has to be the leader of Europe, but he knows he can't do that alone. So there's been already talk immediately after Brexit with Italy and Germany. So I think, you know, there's some discussion at the leaders level about, you know, trying to get our act together, because if we watch the North Korean crisis, we're not convinced by the way the US is handling it. We are not sure about, you know, Putin and Xi Jinping. So, you know, Brexit shouldn't mean a weaker Europe, basically.
Patrick, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I just want to disagree. Sorry, Catherine. I think if you look to what's happened in France, what's happened in Germany, with the upcoming of these protest parties and the upcoming of these right-wingers, the question is, why is this happening? In my understanding, it has a lot to do with the fact that the EU might be overreaching. The EU, until the early 90s, was very much a common market. And there was not too much policy areas being shifted to Brussels. What happened afterwards with the Maastricht Treaty was a trend towards centralization. I mean, you had the euro, you had competition policy, you had other policy areas being moved over to Brussels. I see these right wings, these populist movements, as a fundamental criticism of this movement, and people are not going to take it any longer. If you go on centralizing Europe, trying to solve Europe and saying we need even a stronger EU, we need a more centralized EU, in the end you will break up the EU as it is. This is my idea. And I think looking at the debate all over Europe right now, this is very much like the debate you had in the United States when the United States of America was set up. And you had a debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, debating how much power, political power, should be given to the federal government and how much should stay with the states. And the US is a much more decentralized state than EU might become in the vision presented by Monsieur Macron or by others. So my prescription for the EU is not to go on centralizing, but take this opportunity to think about some kind of decentralization and just build up something, a more decentralized federalist system. And then this might be the way to get rid of these right-wingers and to fight them.
Yeah, no, but you didn't understand what I was saying. I wasn't saying, I think people completely agree on the overreaching of Europe. What they're really complaining about is that Brussels decide the size of the cucumber you should grow, or the size of your seatbelt, or all those little details in your daily life. This is what people are complaining about the way, you know, the bureaucracy of Brussels. And what the Macron France wants is to get rid of that and not to have Brussels interfere in, you know, those little details of your daily life and this and that, to get rid of this heavy, you know, European bureaucracy and focus on the main thing. It's not about creating a federal state, but having a common vision of, you know, of foreign policy, a common vision of security. You know, what is our position with Syria? What can we do with jihad? What can we do with climate? What can we do with those big issues? And the idea is to focus on the big issues and try to have a common vision on those things that matters at a global or continental level, but not, and forget about the size of cucumbers and whatever, you know, Brussels has been dealing with.
Right, so very short comment, last comment, Patrick, on that.
Okay, just very short. I mean, if you propose to install a European finance minister, if you propose to install a European budget, and these are proposals by President Macron, that means a trend towards centralization. You can look at every federal state. You can look at the United States, you can look at Germany, you can look at Switzerland, you can look to all these federal states in history, and there were scientific studies on that. And you see, as soon as the top federal level gets the power to tax, that means in this case a European budget, a European tax, a European Minister of Finance, this sets up a huge trend towards centralization. And in that respect, it's not only about the size of cucumber. It's much more.
Nick is thinking that he's happy that he's getting out of it. So I wanted to ask you, Nick, you know, just along the discussion of EU. So obviously there are a lot of disagreements, a lot of issues, you know, over there, and you are leaving all that bickering, so it makes you happy, hopefully. But there are problems associated with your departure. So, for example, I used to work for Goldman Sachs for a long time. A lot of my colleagues are telling me that they are leaving London. Their office is going to stay, but they are going to move some of the functions, headquarters functions, from London to other cities, for example, Frankfurt. And it's not Goldman Sachs only. There are a lot of other companies that are doing that. So you're starting to see the real impact in business. I mean, real tangible impact in terms of how business community is adjusting their operations to the reality, which is, you know, you're not part of the EU very soon. So do you have any comments as to what kind of impact you're actually really seeing and what you're doing in terms of mitigating these negative implications?
Well, firstly, it's not true that we're seeing that impact in the UK. I mean, there have been two decisions of relocation of headquarter functions. One is the European Investment Bank. That's not surprising, given its link with the Eurozone. And the other was a Russian bank that decided to set up a new headquarters in the Eurozone rather than the UK. Other financial institutions are indicating that they may transfer a small number of staff to Eurozone locations, not one location, but a variety of Eurozone locations, simply so as to ensure that they can continue passporting. But the current discussions that are going on are intended to try and ensure that some kind of continuation of the passporting mechanism or an equivalence regime is achieved. And you can understand that with the importance of financial services to the UK, this is a very high priority for the UK government. And as I said before, overall, we believe that provided such sensible arrangements can be put in place, which will be of mutual benefit, that Britain will remain Europe's leading financial centre and one of the globe's leading financial centres because of the fundamental competitive advantages that we enjoy. I mean, listening to the discussion about Europe and the question of the extent to which there is a continuing drive for deeper integration. I mean, this was at the heart of British concern about continuing membership of the EU. And Britain had always had an alternative vision for the European Union, which that it should be more flexible, more focused on competitiveness, more focused on driving trade deals, for instance, with the rest of the world, more outward-looking, and less concerned with regulation and taking more powers to itself, a skepticism about the creation of a greater European cooperation in relation to defence, for instance. And although that manifested itself in the popular sense with straight cucumbers, actually we always talk about straight bananas in the UK. That was undoubtedly, if you like, a background and an irritant in the referendum debate. But the fundamental cause of Britain's leaving the European Union was actually to do with migration and free movement. And it was, I think, Europe's determination that they would maintain unchecked free movement as one of the 4 pillars of the European Union, that there could be no compromise on that, which actually drove Britain to the point of exit, because we had seen very high levels of net migration in the UK. Yes, from the rest of the world as well, but also from within the EU. And the prevailing sense in the UK was that this was not within our control. There is an ongoing debate about the right level of migration and so on. And there, of course, is a discussion about the extent to which actually it was economically beneficial to us. But nevertheless, the public felt that it was not under our control. And I think an interesting question for the EU, particularly given the salience of migration issues at the moment, is the extent to which it will hold on to this fundamental freedom within the EU, of the EU of 27, and so on. We've already seen that Schengen is suspended, that actually the borderless Europe is no longer the reality. So I think that's a very interesting question, and there is certainly a school of thought, if I can just say this quickly, in the UK, that actually, if Europe's response to Britain being outside of the EU is to deepen its integrationist agenda, and we've seen what the President of the Commission, Juncker, has said about that within the last few days, and if it loses a focus on driving competitiveness and so on, that actually it could well be that Britain, outside of those arrangements, it had already been outside of the Eurozone, is already outside Schengen, but the Britain could considerably be to Britain's advantage.
But this whole immigration issue, which obviously is a center of this whole discussion, aren't you concerned about the potential shortage of labor in certain segments of economy, especially service sector, retail, hospitality, where you do employ a very large number of non-UK citizens from other parts of EU? How are you going to deal with potentially a huge outflow of these people who are actually currently employed?
Well, I think it's clear that the reason for the high levels of net migration was that Britain's economy was creating jobs at a remarkable rate, actually, over the last 7 years. Something like 3 million jobs net have been created in the UK, and that had resulted in a sucking in of labour. And the issue for us was that only half of that net migration was under, if you like, political control, and the other half was happening economically, but wasn't under political control, and as a consequence couldn't be planned for. And it was the impact, I think, an impact, for instance, on public services that politicians underestimated, and so on. So I think to say that just because it is going to be under our control doesn't mean that there won't be a continuing level of migration in response to the demands of the economy. But I think that we will have control over that, and the design of that scheme is now the subject of lively discussion in the UK.
I think immigration is such an important topic for France and in Germany, so I wanted to get your perspective on it as well. Obviously, you can't really separate the issue of immigration from a lot of the very, very sad incidents we have been seeing, including the one that you just had in London, terrorism. And the reality is a lot of these people are homegrown. They are second generation people who actually were born in UK, born in France, and born in Germany. So it's maybe not a question of immigration. Technically speaking, they're really citizens of your countries. So we're talking about much wider issue. It's an inequality issue, and you know, obviously it's related to immigration. Caroline, you had a thought on this when we were talking about this earlier. Do you have would you like to share your view on this immigration challenge?
It's interesting what Nick said. Indeed, Schengen has been temporarily, well, not completely suspended, but in the state. The idea is when you have a state of emergency, we should suspend Schengen. And this is what's happening right now in France. We had so many of those attacks. But the issue is complicated. It is immigration. It is multiculturalism. How do we integrate Islam in our society? And it is about social inequality. And it's a whole mix of reason, and it's something that has to be dealt obviously this is typically the kind of question that has to be dealt at the continental level. That includes not only the UK, but Switzerland, but Norway, I mean, other countries that are neither in Schengen nor in the Eurozone or not in the EU at all. And obviously, of course, you know, losing very successful, I mean, I'm not saying that clearly it's a minority of people, dissident, you know, those homegrown terrorists are only a minuscule minority of those sons of immigrants, but somewhere our societies failed to integrate them, and there's a huge question that we have to address as a collective, you know, European civilization or whatever. And we're just starting to deal with that. And we're, you know, it's like we're looking at, we tend to look at it as like an elephant. One is saying it's the, you know, that's the tail, that's the ear, it's actually the whole elephant we have to look at.
And in Germany too, Patrick, you're telling me that immigration is definitely one of the hottest items on the political, you know, debate right now. But you don't really see any radical change after the election in terms of how the German government is going to handle the immigration policy.
No, not really. First, I would like to underline what Caroline said. I mean, the majority of Islamic immigrants, be it the first, the second, or the third generation, they are pretty well integrated in Germany. And you have tons of stories of entrepreneurs, of people working like usual, and they are completely integrated in the economy. It's definitely a very small minority. The question why that happens, I wonder, I think that there was a huge impact of the internet and the fact that you can, and the upcoming of radical Islamic in other states, and this is spread over the internet to certain pouches, small groups of people in Germany maybe. Immigration, most parties don't like to talk about, especially Chancellor Merkel don't like to talk very much about it because she made this huge mistake letting in immigrants without controlling them at the border. This does not mean that these are bad immigrants. That does not mean that these are Islamic immigrants or whatever. The fact is just that the state gave up controlling the border. And I mean, if you think that the state and the government is there to protect rights, I mean, just letting hundreds of thousands of people into Germany without knowing who is coming, how many are coming, and even today they don't know exactly who came. I mean, this is just the complete fault of the state, and you just see that the state does not take the roles it should do. So for that reason, a lot of German parties don't talk too much about it. The right wings, they don't want further immigration. The Free Democrats, this is pretty interesting. They're putting forward the proposal to have a very active, proactive immigration policy, which Germany never had until now, some kind of economic-led immigration policy where you really think who is going to make a contribution to the society.
Nick, did you want to say something on that before we move on to Q&A?
Sure. Just very quickly. I mean, I think that where populism thrives, it arises where conventional politics fails, and it produces easy solutions. My job has gone, somebody else has taken my job. I want to put up the economic barriers. That is the prevalent mood in parts of the United States that resulted in the election of Donald Trump. With Donald Trump specifically proposing that those jobs would be repatriated to the United States in a kind of rebuke to globalization. Similarly, when people feel unsafe and see incidents happening in their own country, it is easy for them to reach for a simple cause of blame. It is somehow linked to migration. And again, politics fails if it can't provide solutions to those people that ensures that they do feel safe and that they are protected. And I think that the lesson that I would draw from what happened in the United Kingdom in our referendum campaign, from what happened in the United States, it does stand as a warning to politicians and to conventional politics that if you don't provide the solutions, if you are apparently willing to tolerate high levels of unemployment, if you are apparently willing to tolerate big inequalities in wealth, and not understand the impact of the global financial downturn on huge swathes of society, and if you don't understand the extent to which people don't feel safe either economically or in terms of their own security, if all of your dialogue is what we call in the UK within the Beltway is entirely an internal political dialogue, you are in trouble, and that's something which I think that the impact of that on Europe it'll be very interesting to see whether it becomes subject to the same kind of forces. Actually, Macron's election was in some respects an anti-establishment achievement, and yet, as Caroline said, he was actually of the establishment. But there's no doubt those forces are already at work in Europe as they were in the UK and in the United States.
Well, Japan is supposed to have a big election very soon, so that's a good lesson to listen to. As suspected, we are out of time. I would like to take a few questions from the floor. Is there a microphone? Oh, yeah, thank you.
So a very short question. If you had to pick one country and it was to leave the European Union, which country would it be next? Hungary, Poland, Italy? You have to pick one. Which ones do you think it's going to be?
Okay, quick answer from each of you. One country.
Well, Hungary said it wanted to be out, so.
So the idea is which one we want to leave or which one is going to leave? But I guess it would be good for Germany to leave, but on the other hand, Germany is not going to leave because the German-French axis, the German-French model, this is part of the German policy, so I don't think this is going to happen.
Nick, who is going to follow you?
I think it would be rude to, as Britain is leaving, I don't think we should. And I certainly don't think we should be encouraging anybody else. But I would just observe this. Actually, I also led the campaign to keep Britain out of the euro. So my position was always that we remained in the single market in the European Union, but did not join the eurozone. And I think that was the right decision for Britain. And I observed then, and I will just observe now, no economic and monetary union in history has survived without full political and economic union. No monetary union in history has survived without full economic and political union. And so the question in Europe will be whether, not who leaves for the reasons that the UK left, but whether the eurozone will be able to hold all of its countries in.
Here's another question.
My name is Ishikawa, working for Mitsui and the company. I was in London and I was heading the Japan chamber there. So I'm very pleased to that the Conservative Party, including yourself, may consider soft Brexit. And a question about your idea about transitional deal or period. Do you think that you would uphold that single market and custom union? In that case, that UK may have to follow EU governance, including 4 pillars. So whether that you will be ready to do that, or you may consider Norwegian style, Norwegian model as an alternate to stay in EEA, but not custom union.
Well, I think we need to distinguish between what happens when Britain fully leaves the EU and what is the shape of any transitional arrangement. The Prime Minister has been clear that leaving the European Union will mean leaving the single market and leaving the customs union. And it's not just the UK that wants that. Chancellor Merkel, within a few days of the result of the referendum, reasserted that Britain could not be a continuing member of the single market and yet leave the European Union without accepting the 4 freedoms, including freedom of movement and so on. So in terms of permanent futures, these other, we will not be in the single market, we will not be under the purview of the European Court of Justice, and we will control our borders. The Prime Minister has made that clear. There is an issue about what the nature of a transitional deal might be, and that is currently under discussion. But the Prime Minister's view is you have to agree the destination first before you can then talk about what she prefers to describe as the implementation period, but nobody in the UK thinks that this period will be a long one. And so the current discussion is that it might be a year, and merely sufficient time to enable a trade deal to be finally negotiated and implemented.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, we'll just go over there.
Thank you. My name is Noboru Nagatani, working for Interpol. First of all, thank you all, actually, the speakers. I enjoyed your insight, especially some sort of tit or tat actually discussion between the French and then German. I understand why the UK decided to leave the European Union. I'm just joking. Well, actually, Interpol is located in Lyon, France. So I used to be in Lyon, France for 5 or 6 years. So I know some politics in European Union. And actually, I have 2 questions. One is that the Brexit is often discussed in the context of the economics. I think actually the UK is quite the largest economy in Europe. Number 2, I guess. Number 3? Next to France, Germany, France, and then UK. Well, yeah, it's France. So actually, there is a repercussion of the Brexit, but I think that true repercussion, or potentially more, I would say, worrisome, would be the security repercussion. So actually, Member of Parliament clearly mentioned that one of the biggest reasons of the Brexit is about migrant influx of the huge migrant. Last year, 2016, the Germany actually welcomed more than 1 million immigrant from other part of the region, which is astonishing. So actually, after Brexit, how do you plan? How are you going to plan to design security or security intelligence sharing mechanism internally or together with UK? Actually, the UK has strong intel capability, which is first class, not comparable with other powerhouse in Europe, I would say. It's really first class. So with that UK, within the European Union, again, with that UK, within the European Union, how actually the other powerhouse countries Germany, France ensure the safety and the security of the citizens. I think it's kind of intelligence sharing mechanism, number one. Number two, it is toward Patrick. You mentioned that in general, German people like Brussels, European Union. EU, actually, but you don't like the way Brussels is doing. But I think that's the influence, or the German influence over the Brussels is huge. It's really huge. The German dominate Brussels, I dare to say. So politically, completely, that's right. So actually, French influence over Brussels is waning. That's my personal actual observation. So actually, could you explain about the way you describe? Because I thought that German people would be happy, because I think the German influence is getting bigger and bigger inside of European Union. So actually, two questions. Thank you so much.
Let's start with Nick, if you don't mind answering the first part of the question.
Sure, I was a policing and justice minister in the UK. There was a furious argument ahead of the referendum about this between those who said that one reason not to leave the EU was because of the defense and intelligence and security cooperation between the UK and EU countries, and that those arrangements strengthened our security, and those that said actually things like unfettered free movement are an obstacle to security. I certainly took the former view, but there is absolutely no reason why the arrangements for security can't be replicated in a sensible negotiation between Britain and the EU. So there were practical arrangements which I think were helpful. I think the European arrest warrant was a helpful mechanism that enabled us to bring offenders to justice more rapidly in the UK and in the EU. But there were others in the UK who said, no, what that does is give the European Court of Justice a say over our arrangements. It's not fully within our control, and we don't like it. And in the end, that was an ideological argument, not a practical argument. So I think that while there was a case for saying that these security measures were strengthened by our membership, we will be able to negotiate successfully continued intelligence, defense and security cooperation because fundamentally, just like trade, it is of mutual benefit.
Thank you, Sir Patrick. The German influence on Brussels.
Okay. Germans like the EU, they might not like Brussels. I think there is a huge differentiation that has to be done. The German government and most political parties in Germany definitely are very much pro-EU, and they are very much pro-Brussels. And you might be right that Germany has the biggest power to say in Brussels right now. From a point of view of a German citizen, first of all, you have the problem of the euro. I mean, I suppose if in 1998 you would have asked the German population, do you want to give up Deutschmark and do you want the euro, you would have got an overwhelming majority saying we would like to stay with the Deutschmark. So they got a lot of promises instead, and they got the euro and they got a lot of promises, and these promises were broken. So most people are very worried about zero interest rate policies, a huge monetization of governmental debt, bailout of other countries, and people are just worried about what does this mean. And from an economic point of view, I'm a trade economist, I mean, definitely a lot of the economic differences in Germany, in Europe, in the Eurozone, just hidden under the surface of a very easy monetary policy. And at one point in time, ECB has going to strengthen a monetary policy, and then these economic differences are going to break up again. So the next economic crisis in the Eurozone is definitely coming. So, and people recognize that. That's why they don't like it. The other issue is, even what is decided in Brussels, even if the German government has a mighty say in that, I mean, people just don't see what's going decided in Brussels. I mean, this is far, far away. these people don't speak even German in Brussels. I mean, this is not a nationalist movement, but from a regular German, I mean, they can't understand what's happening in Brussels. They don't have any control over Brussels. This is the feeling. And I mean, if I used to live in the United States. If you compare the United States with the Eurozone or the EU, I mean, in the United States, you have a common language. You have a political debate starting in the evening with the evening news from Washington and going over the whole continent to the West Coast. In Germany, in Europe, you don't have that. You have more than 400 million citizens, and most can't talk to each other because they don't speak the common language. I was covering ECB the first 10 years of the Eurozone, and luckily I know a little bit of French. I mean, so I was able to compare the monetary policy discussions in France and in Germany, and it was as if these discussions were done on different planets. I mean, there was no talking to each other. I mean, these were two completely different discussions going on. This is not something, and in my feeling, people start to understand that this is just going over their head and they don't have any more say in there, and they fear for their democratic rights. And this is some kind of fundamental mistrust against the whole centralization in the EU.
Thank you. Okay, very quickly, because we are at time.
Optimistic note, just for a change, because of Brexit, very Eurosceptic German guy here. First of all, I think that if we talk is nice. I don't think the reason why the British went out of Europe is because we quarrel. It's because I think talking is better than not talking, even if you quarrel. I think if you had some talk here in Northeast Asia between Korea, Japan, China, would be nice. That kind of talk between the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean would be nice, actually. And then the second thing I would like to say is I read a couple of years ago, we have this program called Erasmus, the student program that allows students to study in several universities. It makes people meet. And with this program, there was 1 million babies born out of Erasmus. And there are couples, so there are 2 million people of different nationality. They speak Spanish, Italian, German, French.
English, I imagine.
English also. Not only English, they speak all those languages of Europe, and they produce those Erasmus babies, and I think they are the future of Europe.
On that note, I'd like to say we would like to agree to disagree. That's better than not talking to each other. Well, thank you very much for the great discussion, and please join me to thank this great panel. Thank you very much, Nick, Caroline, and Patrick. Thank you.